Hi, I'm Ryan,
Hey, I'm Nate.
Hello, I'm Steve.
and today on Dungeon Vets Table Talk, we're live with no cuts whatsoever, talking about Flintlock Fantasy. This is sort of what we would probably say is one of the more underrated fantasy genres that there are in the world. I feel
For
like
sure.
sci-fi and fantasy are the two big ones. You know, the medieval Renaissance kind of fantasy, and then there's the way up in the future sci-fi. But this is sort of like right in the middle. This is where would you guys put this on like between Renaissance and steampunk? Basically, it's kind of like right when the
Yeah.
industrial age is starting, right?
Yeah, because you don't have like steam-powered trains all over the place. You don't have in steampunk. You often see what is it like artificial limbs and stuff like that with
Yeah,
people. That's not happening in the Flintlock era.
the Full Metal Alchemist kind of thing is steampunky, but
Sure, yeah, there you
Steampunk
go.
is
That's
definitely leaning more towards like the fictional side and the fantasy side of things, whereas Flintlock, you can be very fantastical and but you can kind of be a little more grounded and realistic with it too, if that's what you're into, considering it's based off of a real part of history with a lot of content, so to speak.
the steampunk era wasn't real.
Not to my knowledge.
Thought it
in
died
the
with the Hindenburg.
medieval
But
and Renaissance eras.
I had a Texas public school education though, so I could be wrong. Maybe steampunk was a thing.
That's true.
But yeah, so this is one of our favorite genres of fantasy. We've run campaigns in it. In That was through Dungeons and Dragons Fifth Edition, but it's sort of cut that. We're not doing cuts. Oh crap! Sort of something we really like a lot. But some examples, some real world examples of Flintlock Fantasy to kind of get your mind turning on what you would kind of want to run. Is I think the biggest one is the Golden Age of Sail. You know, like pirates in the Caribbean, pirates and privateers, merchant vessels, and sort of exploring the unexplored. The Golden Age of exploration as well, which I think is an amazing setting to run a campaign in. It's basically like your players are in the new world and they don't know anything outside of like what's in their direct surroundings. So there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah, really hitting on the exploration pillar with that one. But my favorite is probably like the Napoleonic era when people are really getting into like this new type of warfare, large pitched battles and things like that, which I always think are really cool. And these brand new tactics that the advent of firearms brought to the battlefield
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And with
and artillery.
yeah, but I
That's
also
all.
really like the
Artillery.
the sort of like I guess colonizers versus natives aspect. You know, like Native Americans. You could be like the Brits versus the Zulus kind of thing. Even though that was sort of 1800s, the end
A little later, yeah.
what you might consider the Flintlock era. It's not even flintlocks at that point.
No, it's not. They had the Martini Henry rifle, which was a single shot cartridge rifle, which I think is really neat.
Wow.
For our purposes here, we could definitely expand it a little bit more, I think,
What
because
could you?
we are adding in some pretty fantastical stuff that's not pertinent to history.
Honestly, though, not to get too much in a tangent, but if you're like normally having flintlock stuff, but you're like, okay, I have a fighter who really wants to use this musket, but it's like, what is he gonna? He's got so many attacks. He's gonna reload a muzzle loading musket in like 3 times in what, like 12 or 18 seconds.
Yeah.
It's a little crazy. You could implement something like the Martini Henry, which is not so crazy advanced, but still kind of allows like someone to get more attacks in, but effectively the same damage, you could say, or effect as a musket, just faster.
Interesting. I wish we'd thought about that for my campaign. That would have been interesting. Where was that 3 years ago, Nate?
Didn't you give me something exactly like that though?
Oh, I'm a genius.
I, I was like, "Oh, you're gonna catch on to what I'm doing," because I played a fighter who really liked using a musket. So,
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
hmm I also ended up playing a fighter in that campaign who multiclassed into an artificer, and I think that this is the prime environment for the class of the artificer to thrive in, because sometimes when you're in a more medieval setting, that particular class it can be hard to mesh it with the environment and for everything to make sense. or you just lean really really heavily on this character's basically just another mage, and they just put their stuff into things like technology would be. Um, but yeah, the artificer class and just the building of things in general, I think in this era is what sets it apart. Like you can make more advanced guns like Nate was just talking about, or you can put people are carrying around grenades, and you have sappers on your militaries that are focused on like bringing down walls and stuff, because at this point in technology level, walls are amazing. They're really strong. So
Walls have always been good and always will
yeah,
be good.
walls have always been good, but then artillery came along.
Still good. I mean, you still want the wall. But,
they're
I'm
they're,
sorry,
they're fine.
It
you
still
said
makes me feel safe.
you said artificer, and then all I could think about is, like, little dude crafting bombs to throw in the water and collect all the fish.
Reminds me of
I'm sorry for my mispronunciation.
King Killer Chronicle.
How
Oh,
so?
speaking of other books that out there for Flintlock Fantasy, the Powder Mage trilogy is probably
Obvious
our
one.
favorite, but also the Thousand Names series from Django Wexler. Um, those first two books are really, really good.
And The Way of Renegades.
Well, why don't you tell
Yes.
us a little bit about that book? Who wrote that?
I just wrote a book. I just wrote a fantasy fiction novel set in the Flintlock era, and it is definitely it is not something that just is set there and then is a fantasy story. You definitely like lean into the times and the fact that there are guns and these different inventions and stuff like that. So go check it out. It's available on Amazon.
Yeah, one of the things I find most interesting about that whole era is, like, how quickly that sort of technology was progressing. Because kinda like you invent one thing and people around the world are looking for the next thing to, like, improve upon that, and I feel like we see a little bit of that in Way of Renegades as well, which I
Oh,
think is
thanks.
neat.
Yeah, and it should be worth noting that Wave Renegades was in some parts spawned from the D&D campaign we played in the Flintlock era, and the character specifically that you made, who your character's father, one of the main NPCs in the story, was this amazing inventor and who really sort of um, furthered along the line of furthered along the technology behind rifles and such, and
Yeah, that's totally how you say it.
yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that is definitely something cool thing to have in your campaign. If you want to make a character that has is like make the first gun, or maybe they know are part of a very prestigious crafter of guns family or something like that. It's definitely super neat to have.
Yeah, and I definitely think that it's worth saying the reason to have a campaign in this setting is because you want to utilize guns. You want to utilize these things that would not exist in the medieval or more Renaissance type era. Otherwise, just set it there and avoid any sort of messy entanglements that might come from technology existing. Uh, so, yeah, if you're going to have it in this campaign, plan to use the stuff and actually think about how you're going to implement it
Yeah,
and ride that technological wave, buddy.
Yeah, it
that's
goes without saying that if even if a player wants like, "Well, I really want a gun," it's like, you don't have to have that in your campaign because it brings some changes with it or some considerations that you have to make as a DM for your setting, and things like that, but, speaking of that though, do we wanna touch a little bit on how you implement this mechanically speaking? How do
yeah,
guns
yeah.
work?
So in most rule sets, there are specific rules for how to actually use firearms in a certain campaign. And, there's plenty for D&D, but if you're like me and you like making house rules, they do feel a little bit underpowered compared to a bow or a crossbow to me. So I really particularly was never a fan of the dual wielding light crossbows fighter who would run
Yeah.
around and just that
Pew,
that I
pew,
didn't
pew,
really
pew, pew, pew,
like.
pew, pew.
It wasn't my fantasy. But for some people it is. I liked doing that more with guns because I think that's cooler. The gunslinger sort of thing. Um, and so when you're in a world that is like that, it makes perfect sense to me that if it's as easy as pulling out a gun and from your pocket, then they should probably be easy to use. It should be a tool that is extremely powerful, but relatively easy to get a hold of compared to, say, like the skill required to be able to shoot a bow if you haven't shot a bow before.
One of the biggest reasons they were implemented in real life because it was more or less as simple as taking some concept and be like, "Hey, take this, point, shoot in that direction."
Mhm.
Yeah, and if they're that common, then I think guns should be able to spice up every class, not just a gunslinger or a fighter or something like that. When you think about old school naval combat, back, when kids were unfortunately uh, part of naval combat, what they would do is just have a bunch of, they would have like a huge vest with a bunch of like pistols. And they would just reload them and then run around. And so people who are on their side could just take the pistol, shoot, put it back, and you would just have a tons and tons and tons of pistols. And it's super cool to me to have like a sorcerer who blasts somebody with a fireball and then turns and also shoots them. Reminds me of
I
Fable 3, which I played a lot of.
I thought you were gonna say, for me, it's cool to have a pistol boy, you know?
Yeah, that's what I thought you were gonna say too. I
That
was
would've
like,
been
man,
great. We should have had one of those in the campaign. Why didn't we hire a pistol boy?
everyone knows that you need to pull from history to make your fantasy more compelling. So
Yeah.
there's a little thing for you to put into your
And
campaign.
what's great, if you're like me, then along the same lines, the industrial era, so you have plenty of kids in factories, which is also great.
Also historical.
Endangering children is, you know, a Flintlock hallmark, I guess.
Long
Now
sto
to your table.
But let's say, like, so that was all Flintlock stuff. How do you make it more fantastic? How do you run it in a world where there are dragons and elves and wizards and such, other than changing your Flintlock child into a Flintlock kobold?
Yeah, it really depends on you as a DM, I think. Do you want this to be a ubiquitous thing, like, throughout your setting? Is it built into your setting from the start? Like, we play that way. We were playing kind of the fantasy version of that era of
Mhm.
the dawn of flintlocks and things like that. Or do you want them to be a little more rare? Like, maybe you have, like, an artificer or some inventor who's one of your players, and they're like, "I" and they come to you and like, "Hey, I would really like to try to, like, invent the gun," basically. And it could be just them that has it, and you can make that work. It really depends on like the scale and how you want to implement it into your setting.
Mhm. Definitely. But
We've a couple of times we've mentioned inventing the gun. For those interested in who haven't already, who are not aware, you can go check out the events of the first campaign of Critical Role. They had a character who basically invented their world's gun, and that's it's all laid out for you right there, and you can take inspiration from that.
yeah,
Percival.
absolutely. Percival,
Oh,
long name,
Percival.
something Rollo the Rollo the third. Right?
Yeah, yeah, right.
But say, you're in a world that, let's just imagine, like, is ruled by dragons or something, or maybe a kingdom has a bunch of dragons that are kind of the hegemony, and then in one side of the world they invent guns, and that eventually moves its way over to that side of the world. I could imagine that dragons would not want any of their subjects to get their hands on guns. Because imagine, a cannon, but you fill it full of like bird shot, or large bird shot, dragon shot, you might call it,
Buckshot. Oh,
Dragon
dragon
shot.
shot.
Yeah, there we go.
and a dragon's
Buckshot for
flying,
a
and
cannon.
you use a cannon, a bunch of cannons to just shoot up at a dragon. That would probably be pretty effective.
Yeah,
How
Maybe.
I really like the idea of basically the powers that be kind of want to keep the status quo. They aren't going to want this powerful new weapon in the hands of the people. They're lowers as they would view because again it goes back to like it's so powerful but it's so easy to use.
Mhm.
So
What do
it's
you
This
really puts some power in the hands of the peasantry or whomever it may be.
I think if you wanted to take that concept, like what Nate just said, and incorporate it more into just world building lore, what is the most like peasanty class or race or species? It's probably a human, maybe a goblin, something like that. Like maybe
You
a
can't keep the
particular
goblins down.
it's probably a goblin, but maybe a particular species comes up with the gun, and it's the goblins or the dwarves or something,
Make it
and
goblins.
then it slowly spreads, and then you have this antithesis to the guns all the way across from the goblins, and it's the dragons or maybe the ancient elves or whoever. That's really cool world building, to then leap into and go in either direction, any direction, really, I think.
Yeah, any long-lived sort of race like that, like a dragon or an elf, would immediately be like, "This is bad news coming on the horizon." We keep our power by generations and probably decades of magical schooling that make us more powerful than everybody else. But now you can have just a human or a goblin walk up to you and pull a trigger, and you're just as dead as if you got fireballed from someone who went to school for 30 years or 300 years, maybe. That
Yeah.
is a huge, like, casus belli, like, reason for a war type thing that you could use in your world as well.
I'm gonna keep bringing it back to history and real life, but yeah, the knights. That was exactly like the decline of like the armored medieval knight going into combat who trained basically his whole life to fight like that on a mount on foot and everything. Just a peasant with a freaking matchlock, even that knight's dead.
Yeah,
They hated it.
change the world.
Now
That it
they're a
did.
knight. That's how it works, right?
I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, what we did in my world is that the elves were sort of aware of this changing status quo, and so they ended up doing a bunch of very evil things to make sure that it stayed that way, and it created this huge world war that was that ended in that the ending of it was the backdrop to the campaign that we ran. So we actually had a few characters who ended up being veterans of that conflict.
And yeah, the if you put your campaign in this environment in your world, not every single place in your world is going to be the same. Like uh, Japan was basically in the medieval age long after everyone else was because they didn't let any immigration in. And then when they did, they discovered, people had cannons and guns and stuff, and they were still, like Nate just talked about, they were still armored and samurai wielding swords and stuff. And that cultural dissonance can create really good opportunities for conflict and for just fun encounters for your party.
Yeah, and that reminds me of we had a party member early on in that campaign, Valen, who was a human monk, and he was like, I'm not going to use guns, and I don't got anything against it. I just want to make my character not use guns and see how that goes. I'm like, even though everybody else has guns, he's like, yep, I understood completely. And he did his thing, and he weaved around combat and jumped in front of a person who I remember describing having a shotgun multiple times, and he was blown apart, unfortunately, in like
Yeah, he
session
was.
15 or something. But
Try to pay my respects
yeah, we're thinking about you, Valen,
every day.
every day. Yeah. I mean, but
Yeah,
yeah,
for
I mean, any closing things to say about Flintlock Fantasy? Other than that, we really like it. It's underrated, and you should run a campaign in Flintlock.
And yeah,
Mhm.
as a DM, it's don't let it be intimidating, like bringing guns in or something like that. Like I said before, do it at the scale you feel comfortable with. Work it in mechanically the way you feel comfortable with. I mean, it goes for anything while you're DMing, but it provides a lot of opportunities for fun and for something new. Shake things up a little bit from kind of your typical fantasy setting.
Especially if you've been running fantasy for a few years or sci-fi, it's a nice change of pace going up or down on the technological scale.
And there are rules for a lot of this already that you can just grab and then use and then change as you see fit as you get more comfortable with them.
Very good, guys. So we've been the Dungeon Vets. This has been our talk on the Flintlock Fantasy, our table talk on Flintlock Fantasy. If you like what we do, check out our website. Check out our acclaimed author and member of the Dungeon Vets, Steve D. Wall. He has a book on Amazon, Way of Renegades. But yeah,
Thanks for listening, y'all.
have a good one.
Bah.
How do we turn it off?
Oh.